My name is Christoph Busch. I'm a professor of European business law at the University of Osnabrück and a director at Osnabrück's European Legal Studies Institute. In this short video, I would like to present the key findings of a study on digital platforms and services of general interest, which I have written for the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. The rapid rise of digital platforms as key players in the digital transformation is one of the defining economic and societal developments of our time. Google, Facebook, and Amazon have so much influence on our lives that some observers argue that we are living actually in a platform society. There is also a growing consensus that the power of platforms must be limited. In the policy discourse, platform power is mainly equated with market power and framed as a competition problem. This view is also the underlying premise of several recent regulatory initiatives at the German and European level, such as the Digital Markets Act and the recent reform of the German Competition Act. However, this competition-focused framing is too narrow, and it does not fully capture the power of digital platforms. Why? Because platform power is more than just market power and opinion power. A group of experts appointed by the European Commission recently formulated this very clearly, and I should disclose that I'm a member of this expert group. The control exercised by platforms can no longer be adequately captured by merely looking at economic characteristics and the existing notion of market power. The power held by platforms goes beyond the control over markets and also directly impacts businesses, consumers, and our society at large. And this means that we have to look beyond competition law and close a gap or a blind spot in the current regulatory debate on digital platforms. The core message is the following. First, digital platforms have become infrastructures of our modern society. Second, platforms also play an increasingly important role in the area of services of general interest, such as healthcare, education, and mobility. And third, because platforms have become essential digital infrastructures, we need a new platform infrastructure law that ensures fair access to essential services. The infrastructural function of digital platforms is particularly evident in the areas of information, communication, and trade. Search engines like Google control access to the knowledge of our world. Social media like Facebook and Twitter play a central role in shaping public opinion and social participation. Online marketplaces and app stores form central market infrastructures for the digital economy. And more recently, platforms are developing into large cross-sector ecosystems that offer a multitude of digital services. However, little attention is paid to the fact that digital platforms are playing an increasingly important role in the area of services of general interest. The concept of services of general interest encompasses services on which people depend in their daily lives. In essence, it's the provision of essential goods and services by the community. Traditionally, these include energy, water, mobility, education, health, and culture. Yet, the concept of services of general interest is not permanently fixed or static, but open to development and subject to social change. This is shown, for example, by the current debate on a right to fast internet. Digital platforms play a key role in the transformation of services of general interest into digital services of general interest. And they do so in two ways. First, on the one hand, a platformization of traditional services of general interest is taking place. In many areas, digital platforms have become the infrastructures through which access to service of general interest is provided. Second, on the other hand, the question arises to what extent digital platforms themselves have become essential services. In other words, can Facebook and Google be considered as essential services? Let me illustrate this with a few examples. One area in which the disruptive influence of digital platforms on public services can already be clearly seen is the field of urban mobility services. Operators of platform-based digital mobility services are pushing their way into the market. The ride-sharing provider Uber presents itself now as a partner for local public transport and is promoting a new model of public transport. The recent amendment to the German Passenger Transport Act, passed in April this year, is likely to further promote this development. However, the impact of ride-sharing services on public transport is rather ambivalent. In particular, there is a danger that the economic basis of public transport will be eroded if attractive routes and time slots are served by private providers, leaving only the less profitable connections to public providers. And in the US and Canada, some cities have completely discontinued public transportation and left the field to platform-based ride-sharing providers. Another area where digital platforms will play an increasingly important role in the future is public healthcare. Google's acquisition of Fitbit earlier this year makes it clear that the big platform operators are entering the healthcare sector with force. And Amazon is also present here with its new fitness tracker, Halo. Interestingly, the German legislator has been paving the way for digital platforms in the health sector. The Digital Care Act, or the Digitale Versorgung Gesetz, which recently came into force, is intended to make health apps and wearables an integral part of the decentralized digital health infrastructure. Certainly, this can improve the quality of medical care for patients, but we are paying a high price for the app on prescription. By integrating smartphone apps and wearables into the infrastructure of healthcare, the provision of digital medical care is becoming increasingly dependent on digital platforms. A recent example from the United Kingdom may illustrate this. It was recently reported that Apple and Google refused to install an update to the COVID-19 tracing app provided by the UK National Health Service. Why? Because of privacy concerns. These privacy concerns may actually be well justified. However, the necessary trade-off between data protection and health protection is a policy issue and a question that should not be determined by a US corporation, but should be rather discussed politically and decided by the democratically elected legislator. Instead, it is Google and Apple who determine which data protection rules effectively apply. Or, as Politico has recently put it, Google and Apple have become the world's biggest privacy regulators. Digital platforms are also becoming increasingly important in the field of education. Here, the ambivalence of the advancing platformization of services of general interest becomes very clear. On the one hand, it is certainly more than welcome that Google is providing digital infrastructures for homeschooling during the current pandemic. But behind the scenes, the competition for dominance in building a digital infrastructure for education is already raging. From the platform's point of view, this is a huge market opportunity. When students have become familiar with the product of a particular provider, lock-in effects can quickly occur. And such lock-in effects can also arise for schools and teachers if the teaching material has been adjusted to the technical requirements of a specific system. In the US, the use of digital platforms in classrooms is increasingly seen as a matter of concern. One critical issue is, of course, data protection. However, there is also a debate about whether the operators of digital platforms could eventually influence which content can be offered via the platforms used by schools or universities. From the perspective of academic freedom, this could be a very problematic development. Considering the growing influence of digital platforms on almost all areas of life, the question arises to what extent Google, Facebook, and Amazon have themselves become essential services in our digital society. The German Federal Supreme Court has addressed this question in its much debated Facebook decision from last summer. There, the court argues that the access of users to the social network Facebook determines, at least for parts of the consumers, to a considerable extent their participation in social life, so that they cannot be expected to do without it. In my view, this comes very close to the definition of an essential service. And consider what would have happened if Google had really shut down its search engine in Australia, as it threatened to do earlier this year. Thinking about this possibility makes clear how indispensable Google's search engine has become for most of us. Now, the role of digital platforms as systemically important infrastructures has also been recognized by the European legislator in the Directive on the Security of Network and Information Systems. The directive defines minimum requirements for the cybersecurity of critical infrastructures and explicitly includes online marketplaces, online search engines, and cloud computing services. What follows from all these observations? Competition and media law need to be complemented by a platform infrastructure law which addresses digital platforms as societal infrastructures and actors in the area of general interest. This is not just a nice to have, but it is part of the state's constitutional responsibility for essential infrastructures. And one may add, services of general interest are a blind spot in the EU's Digital Services Act package, which does not address this important dimension of the platform society. The political debate on how to regulate platforms as infrastructures for services of general interest has just started. However, it is possible to outline some elements of a future platform infrastructure law, which could be modeled on the existing regulation of network infrastructures. Unlike competition law, the regulation of network industries aims not only at ensuring a workable competition, but also at ensuring fair and universal access to essential services such as water, energy, telecommunications, or postal services. This idea can be transferred to platform infrastructures. Ensuring fair access to digital services of general interest means, for example, accessibility requirements must also apply to ride-sharing providers in the new public transport. The concept of universal service obligations could also be applied mutatis mutandis to digital platforms. Ride-sharing providers that have become an integral part of the public transport infrastructure must offer their services to all parts of the local community, not just on the more lucrative routes. And one may ask, is it really acceptable if access to services of general interest, such as education and healthcare, is only possible with a Google user account? I don't think so. Another pillar of platform infrastructure law is, of course, price regulation for platform services. This may include traditional price regulation, such as limits to surge pricing by ride-sharing providers. But there is also a new type, what might be called price regulation 2.0, when consumers pay for platform services with their personal data. This raises the question of whether there should be a right to surveillance-free access to essential services. Infrastructure platforms could also be subject to stricter requirements with regard to protecting fundamental rights. There is a rather timid reference to this in Article 12 of the Proposal for a Digital Services Act, which calls on providers of online intermediary services to pay due regard to the fundamental rights of their users. The German Federal Constitutional Court goes one step further. In its Stadionverbot decision of 2018, the court argued that providers of essential infrastructure can be subject to a state-like responsibility for protecting fundamental rights. When applied to digital platforms, this could translate into a right of access to digital services of general interest. And it also means that platforms must offer a fair procedure for enforcing access claims and effectively protecting user rights. In my view, it is doubtful whether the new notice and action rules of the proposed Digital Services Act are really sufficient in the light of this fundamental rights standard. In the US, there is already a lively debate about the need for federal rules of platform procedure. And similarly, there's an emerging literature on the procedural turn in platform regulation at the European level. One could think about many more elements of a future platform infrastructure law. For example, the responsibility of infrastructure platforms for cybersecurity, environmental protection, and human rights and the supply chain. There's also the question of how the institutional framework of infrastructure regulation should be designed. Do we need a new division, a new infrastructure division in the Federal Cartel Office or in a future Digitalministerium? Many questions are still open, but one thing seems clear to me. The topic of platforms and services of general interest certainly belongs on the political agenda.